Okay, well, good afternoon or good morning or good evening for some of you. Welcome to our fourth TBM Executive Advisory Forum. First off, I'd like to thank Todd Tucker and Ralph for being our presenters today. We are really thrilled to be able to understand the history around technology business management, and then also to be able to get a perspective from a CIO. So Todd and Ralph, thank you so much for joining today. As a reminder, for those of you that are thinking about attending the TBM conference, we do have a special discount code just for this forum. Feel free to use Advocate 400, and you will get $400 off the registration. So, as a reminder, the entire audience, you're all on mute. With that said, at the end of each speaker, we will have Q&A for 5 minutes. There's two ways you can ask a question. The first way is we do have the Q&A box. Another way you can do it is you can raise your hand. If you do it that way, I will go ahead and unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question. I guess the third way would be if you can't do Q&A or raise your hand, go ahead and use chat. So with that said, we'll start off with Todd Tucker. I think of Todd as one of the founding fathers of technology business management. So much so that he actually wrote a book. So I highly recommend going out and getting the Tbm book. So with that said, Todd, it's all yours, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. And let me put this into presentation mode here. It will do it for me. It's being kind of strange. Okay, Tim, can you see my slides still?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Good. All right, so it's a pleasure to be on. I recognize a few of the folks that I see in the attendee list. It's great to see, and Ralph, obviously great to be on the phone with you again. And I think you could tell this story time and again as well. So feel free to interject here or whatever. It'd be great to kind of make this interactive. I think most of you probably know a little bit about the council, but just by way of introduction, the council is a member-led organization that was founded back in 2012 as a nonprofit. I'll describe a little bit of the history, but right now we have just a phenomenal board of directors, as we have really since the inception of the TBM Council, again, back about 7 years ago. A lot of the board members that we have been members of our board for the entire time, Ralph being one of them, Larry Godek that you see there from First American, although recently retired, but he's been a member of our board since the beginning. Chris Pick, of course, who is also very much the founding driver behind the TBM Council. I like to say it was his crazy idea that led to the formation of the nonprofit, the TBM Council, and obviously he was the one that really drove a lot of the work in the beginning. I certainly, enjoyed working with him on that, but it was his brilliance that led to where we're at. James LaPlane has been on since the beginning. Guillermo Diaz represents Cisco. Guillermo, I know his role at Cisco has changed, but before Guillermo, we had Rebecca Jacoby, and I'll share a little bit about her story here in a minute. Just really quickly, kind of a brief history, like where and how did this start? To be really frank about the beginning of the TBM Council and really TBM as a discipline, it started with conversations with Apptio's CIO advisory board. I know Ralph was part of those early conversations, Rebecca was, Larry was, and then some other folks, like I remember Tony Scott from Microsoft, and Tom Murphy now at UPenn, but with AmerisourceBergen, et cetera. It was really a good group that would have conversations about this emerging discipline that even at the time didn't really have a name. I remember the debate about the name. There was at the time a lot of talk about IT financial management, IT cost transparency, IT service management topics were woven into all of that. And we settled on, really the board at the time settled on technology business management. And I remember it was something that Rebecca Jacoby said. She said, look, if you name this IT anything, it will be viewed purely as an IT thing. And, her point of view, and I think most of the board members, was that TBM should be viewed as a collaborative discipline that's practiced with the folks that are business partners of IT, of the CIO. So that includes CFO, even CEO, but line of business leaders as well. So the name was intentionally chosen not to include the acronym IT, given what it tends to imply. We're also seeing a lot of tech organizations or IT organizations position themselves as tech. Sometimes that was because they were like a global shared services organization that provided foundational technology. Other times it was more of a business technology focus. So there were other reasons behind that name. And at the time, there were a lot of efforts, obviously, by Apptio and other vendors in the market to drive TBM or ITFM or what have you from a tool perspective, but we felt there was a need to address the discipline side of TBM at that time. So organizational practices around data, the value conversations as we came to coin them and so forth. So that all played a part. Formed the council as a nonprofit back in 2012, and at that time we did a few things to kind of launch it. One was simply to release an early version of the TBM framework, which if you're not familiar with that, there's a lot of info on the TBM Council website about it. We also launched a study of a survey-based assessment of TBM in organizations, and we ended up running that across a little over 300 companies at the time. Again, Ralph, I know Clorox participated in that, so your team was part of it there. But really a great group of responses into that allow us to assess and benchmark TBM practices, everything from how they were defining what they delivered, the value proposition, the transparency or approach to transparency, costing, and so on. We're all part of that. And then also at that time, because it was very research focused, we began researching and writing the iBook. We actually, if you're not familiar with it, we have an Apple iBook that we published back in, it was probably about 2013 when that was released, but it featured videos and it featured actually the TBM index. You could participate through that book, believe it or not, if you had an iPad. So did some innovative things, launched the conference the year after, and I think, again, many of you are probably familiar with it. Tim mentioned it at the beginning. If you're not and you haven't been to the conference before, I strongly encourage coming to the conference in November. It's always just a phenomenal event, and I think you'll find that it is very, very worth your time. I'll talk about it a little bit later as well, but we did that. We launched our awards program back then as well, and since then we've recognized a few dozen companies for their excellence in TBM. In fact, Clorox was a winner shortly after, Ralph, you left Clorox. But great award program that we've run where we've had stories and story after story told through that mechanism. Kind of continuing on, one of the things we launched in 2014 were a series of work groups. Some were vertically focused. One was focused on the discipline of IT finance or CFO of IT. We actually ran that for really 5 years from 2014 to 2018. We've taken a pause this year to focus on some other things, which I'll share here in a bit as well. But that really was the start of a very collaborative, more formalized effort around TBM. And while I think some of the work we did, we thought we would drive a little more of an ambitious output from it, it led to what has become the standards committee and work groups efforts that we have now. So it was very foundational. We learned a lot from those efforts, and there was some really good collaboration. One of the things we did too, really kind of based on those learnings, was launched a federal, what was called the IT Cost Commission. It was actually an advisory commission for the federal government, launched in 2015. We had a great group of federal agency professionals behind it, practitioners of what has become TBM in the federal government. We had support from the White House administration, both the prior administration and the current one. It's one of those rare things that has kind of continued across administrations at this stage. But what we really did there was research what would TBM look like in federal agencies, and we wrote a report that we published in 2016 that encapsulated some of those recommendations and later became part of some of the federal agenda. It's actually part of what the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, publishes in terms of guidance for federal budgeting for IT. Similarly, there was a White House summit. One of the kind of proudest moments of my career was actually going to the White House, what's called the old Executive Office Building, or the Eisenhower Office Building, which is basically attached. And we presented TBM there. We had people from the administration. We had some of our CIOs. Tom Murphy was there, Barat from Newport News, and so on. Just a great day spent there advising federal agency leaders, both CIOs and CFOs mostly, on TBM. Pretty wild event where we had literally like 5-star generals sitting in that room. TBM is now part of the President's management agenda. So if you're ever curious, or maybe if you work in government, I encourage you to take a look at that. That was published last year, and it includes really the White House's vision for management in the 2022 kind of time frame. It's setting forth really private sector practices to be adopted by the U.S. federal government, federal agencies, and TBM is one of those. It's what they call a cross-agency priority goal, or a CAP goal for federal agencies. So it's made its way all the way up to the President's agenda there. We launched another version of the TBM Index in 2015 with McKinsey. Again, great work that was done. It was a little bit of a different approach that we took with McKinsey in doing that, but again, really validated that the maturity around TBM practices led to a number of outcomes for enterprises, from not only cost efficiencies or financial outcomes, but also speed to market was something that we looked at, and that was something positively influenced by TBM. And then customer satisfaction, another thing that was assessed in that, and it was also positively impacted. So I think it was good to show that TBM matters more than just the sort of the financial benefits. It matters for customer satisfaction. It matters for speed to market, and things of that nature as well. At that time, we also really, this is my sort of main project or focus at the time, was writing the Tbm Book, most of which I finished in 2015, but we didn't publish until May of 2016. Launched it at our London TBM Summit, which again was quite an event. And so that, if you're not familiar with that work, if you want to get a hold of the book, it can be found on Amazon, or if you just simply want to become a member, you can access an electronic version simply via our community site. So if you're not familiar with that, let me know. Be happy to point you directly to it. It's easy to find. The goal of that was not to make money. Nobody gets rich publishing business books. But it was important for us to really define and articulate what TBM is and share stories about TBM success from real world implementations. That year, in 2016, we also formed our standards committee. So now it's 3 years in running, and that committee has primarily been focused on the TBM taxonomy. So the taxonomy was born out of I would call it a vendor effort. Aptio, ISG, KPMG were some of the principal parties behind that taxonomy. But in 2016, we handed the taxonomy to this standards committee, and the standards committee has governed it ever since. So we had 2.0, that was the first version to come out. Now it's at 3.0. We'll probably have a 3.x or a 4.0 in November. We'll decide upon that here shortly. So we do iterate on that. I'll talk a little bit about that work as well. And then we launched our education and certification program in 2017. Feels like yesterday to me, but since then, we've gone on to train a few thousand people, as you can see there. And these are typically, if you're not familiar with that program, we're typically training TBM program leaders, Office of the CIO, Enterprise Architecture, PMO. If you're embracing Agile, you might have a Lean Agile type of program in place, those program leaders. So we see, kind of all types, and then senior TBM analysts or administrators also oftentimes come through that program. And so we've trained about 3,500 in total, and about 1,400 or so, 1,500 have been certified, have gone through all the steps to become certified. So if you're interested in certification, this is part of that path. I'll share a little bit more about that later on as well, because we would obviously welcome having you all go through that particular program. And then more recently in 2018, actually at the conference last year, we launched a Taxonomy Extension Kit. The intent of that was to allow for work group efforts to extend the taxonomy for vertical industries or other needs. And so that kit has been instrumental in some of the work that we're doing today. I'm going to pause for a moment. And Tim, I don't know if you're seeing any questions.
Nothing yet. I was just going to let you know you have about 5 minutes, and then we can open up for Q&A, Todd.
Excellent. Okay, let me quickly get through a couple of things. So just kind of history-wise, I think that gives you some ideas about what the council has produced and focused on and things of that nature. You know, some of the things I always like to do is or talk about are some of the stories that we've seen, and I'll tell one or two just really quickly here. Larry Godek, who I mentioned earlier, Larry's one of our first board members, is actually the first co-chair of the TBM Council's board, and along with Rebecca Jacoby. And Larry is one of these CIOs who, when you meet him, he's just very matter of fact, very straightforward. And he was at First American, which was coming out of the financial crisis. And since they are title insurance, their business is tied to the economic cycle of real estate. So you can imagine kind of how that looked in the, post-2009 kind of era. So what started as conversation around, I think cost pressures became a conversation. Are we spending the right amount on IT to grab market share when the economy recovers? Because they knew it was cyclical, they knew it would recover, they take a long-term view at First American, so they were looking at that. And so for Larry, what TBM meant was really answering that question, certainly finding efficiencies in what they were doing, but really use it to drive investment into the things that really, really mattered for First American. And they actually just said the thing that really matters are what they called customer-facing technology. So they used TBM to create transparency of their entire portfolio. In the beginning, it was very, very rough and ready. They lacked a lot of the data that we all know is needed for TBM, but they made do with what they had, and they started making decisions very early on based on that. And again, the focus being on moving money to the customer-facing technology that they had. One of my favorite things about what Larry did is partnered very, very closely with the CFO and the CEO. The guy in the background there is actually their CEO, who spoke at our conference in, I think it was 2014, about their programs. So Larry had the CEO there. I've talked to Mark Seaton, their CFO, and he did just a phenomenal job of driving that partnership across the organization, and that allowed them to drive many of the outcomes that they had. So Larry's was more of a story of that. Now, what they've done as well is if you ever hear their full story, you'll know that they've every year they drive a new phase of their TBM roadmap. So it started out as a high-level degree of transparency, has morphed into the ways that they drive accountability, drive their portfolio management. They drove to a chargeback implementation in just 3 months. They've really done some amazing things. They're using it to drive cloud adoption as well and do that smartly. So a lot of successes from that particular story. I won't go into detail on Cisco, but here's the thing I will comment on Cisco is what they tied it to was really their IT as a service transformation. So they were implementing in some ways, very traditional IT service management approaches, but really using TBM to empower IT service owners and leverage those service owners to drive continuous efficiencies and improvement in value for money. And again, it's been a success story from really day one. Not only did they win an award from us back in 2013, but they won an award again just back in 2017. I think it was 2 years ago. And they've shown continuous improvement over that period of time. We've seen wonderful adoption with state of Washington, actually made it into legislation. At MasterCard, the thing I love about the thing they're doing there is TBM is part of the way they manage the products that face the market. So it's part of, some of us kind of think of it as an agile transformation. Agile at scale is part of this. They've adopted a scaled agile framework. TBM is part of that as well. But it's really the way they manage products at MasterCard. So Ed McLaughlin, who's standing there in front, and then Mary Griffith, who's standing at sitting at the far right. They're partnered in really creating these outcomes in the marketplace. So it's not just a quote IT thing. It really is about the way they manage profitability at MasterCard. I'm going to say just a few words about this, and then I'm going to kind of skip to the end here. The focus areas for us right now, if you're thinking about maybe ways to benefit or get engaged, is we've again emphasized a work group approach. We have 5 vertical work groups that are official right now that are going. You can see those here: banking, insurance, manufacturing, state government, healthcare. Banking is really retail and investment. Healthcare is really providers and payers. So we have 2 kind of subgroups going there. Insurance is your more traditional property and casualty and life and things like that. But these groups are all working on the taxonomy extensions that I mentioned earlier. So at the end of the year, you should see formal version 1 taxonomy extensions for those particular vertical industries. And we feel like we're just getting started here. So if this is of interest to you and you want to see it for an industry that you don't currently see represented, please let me know. It's something that we're going to be kicking off at the conference for next year as well to expand the list of industries that are represented. And then we have a couple of efforts going around cloud and agile as well. Again, there are ways for you to get engaged. So all of these are, again, collaborative efforts driving toward some outcomes. I'm going to skip the slides, but Tim, I'll make these available through you if you want to share any of these slides. Great. Please do. One last thing just on kind of getting involved. I didn't realize I had so many builds in here. Getting involved, or if you want to learn more, again, as Tim said, as I said earlier, join us at the conference. We are kicking off or having additional work group meetings that are there, but I will say they are filling fast. We do have limited space, so I'm not just saying this as a pressure tactic to get you to register for the conference, but if you are interested, I have to just say that those meetings are filling pretty fast. There's a lot of interest in them. And if you're interested in a class, like I mentioned earlier, you can find our calendar online, and we deliver usually several classes a month. And we've delivered them all over the world. So, you can usually find a class that's either close by. We will have one at the conference as well. So if you're interested in joining at the conference, that is an option. So that was fast and furious. I'm going to hand it back to you, Tim. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great. Todd, as always, awesome job. We actually do have a couple questions. I'll let my colleague Kristen read them off.
Hi, here's question number 1. How many companies have adopted TBM?
It's hard to say. I can tell you from a couple of perspectives, and I'll start with just one of the easier ones since we were founded by Apptio. Apptio is our founder and technical advisor. I know that from adoption of Apptio products, that's a good proxy for TBM implementation, and it's about half of the Fortune 500. It's about 60%, give or take, of the Fortune 100. Large enterprises, you see a lot of adoption, whether it's called TBM or not, you see a lot of those practices employed. Among smaller enterprises, it would taper off as you go smaller, just tends to be that, but you still will see adoption even in smaller enterprises. In government, state governments, I'm aware of 7 or 8 that have adopted TBM. Federal agencies, we're seeing that it's really mandated to a degree. So heavy adoption in federal government, although the way they look at it is kind of evolving. So it's a kind of a complicated answer. So hopefully that provides some idea of its adoption.
Great.
Here is question number 2. How does this differ from Itil Financial Management Process?
Yeah, so Itil defines what's called service economics, and it's part of the service strategy book. If you're familiar with Itil, there's a series of books that make it up. Service strategy is where you'll find service economics, and many of the same principles that we talk about are included in service economics, but there is no taxonomy. There are very few details around costing and creating transparency. It does talk about cost recovery, i.e. chargeback, charging, pick your phrase. So it talks about some of those principles as well. But it's just not quite as deep as we've gone with TBM. They're definitely complementary. There's no reason to view them as being at odds with one another. That is certainly not the case. In fact, I would argue that they're better oftentimes when implemented together.
Great. Okay, question number 3. Where do you see the TBM conferences going in terms of both format and content?
Yeah, format-wise, we found a format that I think works pretty well, which is to start off the conference with very TBM Council-centric elements, things that really focus on the discipline, on standards. This is where we have our work groups meet. It's where we have our education classes offered, which, by the way, we're expanding this year. And then as the conference progresses, really starting on Wednesday and heavy into Thursday, the last 2 days, it gets very product tool-centric. And honestly, very, very focused on Apptio use cases. It's not exclusive that, but it tends to emphasize that. And so there's a lot of content, for example, this year that's being split into tracks based on maturity of adoption, and a lot of that obviously being very tool-centric. So I like that format because it allows us to address both the discipline and the actual implementation or usage in the same event. And it's always been one of those events where we get executives to the event, usually for the first couple of days, and then practitioners to the event for the entire time. So it's again, I think it's a model that works. So I don't see that changing. It could, but this year that's the format, and it's a format we've followed for several years now.
Outstanding. Well, we have a lot more questions, and what we'll do is we'll post those up on our TBM exec forum in LinkedIn, and we'll also provide Todd's email. Ralph, I'll go ahead and let you share the screen. Todd, again, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. That was a lot of content, and I'll definitely put this also on our YouTube site where we have all of our past forums.
Great.
So with that said, I hand this over to my good friend Ralph. Thank you very much for presenting, and I think the audience, I think they're going to love your presentation here.
Okay, well, happy to be following Todd. A great update in kind of both history and present state of the TBM movement as I kind of look at it. So I thought I'd tell this in a bit more of a fun way, a bit of my history and background of involvement in TBM through kind of a narrative. So I'm going to tell you a kind of a coming of age story. It's my story, but I think it's probably all of your story too. So I'll start by introducing you to the hero of the story. Okay, so this guy on the left, you know, and we might, maybe we'll call him Clark. He runs a data center, right? He worries a lot about speeds, legacy code, on-prem versus cloud, and is focused on his capital and operational budget. He's a department head of a cost center, and every year he's got to fight for spare change at the corporate budget table. Reminds me a lot of my time back in the 80s and early 90s when I was a data center leader at AT&T. So a couple of interesting things happened in that 80s and 90s and really in the early 90s. So first, I had a career transition where I left my role as a kind of developer and technologist to become what AT&T at the time called a resource planner. Essentially, I left the IT delivery function to become a manager managing the value investments for one of the business units within AT&T with its IT counterpart. Now, today we would call this role a TBM manager. Now, remember, tools are non-existent. This is, in fact, when I built my first Lotus 123 spreadsheet, so that gives you some dating of when that was. So it allocated costs to the various departments in the business units of shared assets like mainframes or disk farms based on usage, size of department, and so on. So this was 1993. And essentially, I chart this as the true start of my personal TBM journey. I was incredibly proud of this spreadsheet, and I think I maxed out the limit of rows and columns that Lotus supported at the time. So some other things happened around that time, right? So the first commercial browser was launched in the mid-90s. By the end of the 90s, the term e-business had gone mainstream. Technology leaders who could figure out how to automate manual processes in areas like tech support, customer service, and simple e-commerce were in small numbers beginning to become relevant to certain businesses, and this became known as the dot-com era. And they were kind of the unsung heroes of the dot-com era, unsung much like our friend Clark here. So after my time at AT&T, I joined Cisco in the early days, so actually pre-Rebecca Jacoby becoming CIO. Pete Solvik was the CIO at the time and hired me. I was very privileged to be working with Pete. I think he was a really thoughtful, innovative leader in a bunch of fronts. And in one way, he was very visionary in the business of technology and the application of, again, of what we would now call TBM, although we didn't call it that yet. In fact, one of the top requested topics at the Executive Briefing Center in the early 2000s at Cisco was for IT leaders at Cisco to explain how we governed IT and how we managed Cisco's tech spend. So these two slides were slides I used to present at the executive briefings to customers of Cisco interested in this topic back in the early 2000s. Now the tools are getting better. We were no longer just a back office cost center, but we were not quite out front yet either. But if you notice, we talked about things like moving from a cost center to a client-funded model, this sort of evolution toward a show back and ultimately chargeback model. We had breakdowns in terms of where business value was being generated, how we ensure that value was achieved, and so on. So early days of what later became TBM. Now, the challenge is we were in a kind of a tough spot in the middle of all this. We were funded like a cost center, but we were kind of fighting our way to create more value with whoever shared our vision and was willing to invest alongside us to find that value. And there were a few really savvy leaders at Cisco doing just that. But it wasn't going fast enough and it wasn't complete enough. And so Pete made a bold move at the time. He literally gave away half of his budget. He gave it back to the business, and then he partnered with the business on investing for value. So he kept the kind of infrastructure costs and some of the administrative governance part of IT, but literally all the functions, all the IT finance, IT supply chain, IT procurement resources, he reorganized under the budgets of the sales department or operations department. And then the conversation went something like this: you can either spend another dollar hiring a salesperson, or you can invest in a CRM platform. Where would you like to spend your dollar, and where are you getting the most recovery? So it became a business conversation. So bold move made a big impact on Cisco and laid some of the foundation that Becky later used to create the first TBM movement, officially labeled TBM Movement within Cisco. So some of us are still working in cost transparency or showbacks or chargeback, but over 15 years ago, Pete and the team at Cisco really pioneered in that model. So now I've done this really quickly. I mean, we've only got 20 minutes, and I wanted to keep this moving and leave plenty of time for Q&A. There were lots of lessons along the way, lots of heroes in this cast, and lots of people I left out, a whole diverse set of leaders that played different roles through this journey. We didn't win every battle. We had some setbacks. There were some challenges with the showback, chargeback CFP models within Cisco that were later kind of adapted. But we did impact not just our own companies, but many, many other companies were inspired by Cisco's e-business model and lead, including many of the companies that later became TBM Council charter or founding members. Now, I was at Cisco both pre.com and post.com. Now, like most bubbles, people found out that those were real fundamentals, real sales, real value creation did just fine. Those folks are the real superheroes with real superpowers in terms of IT value management and technology business management. But this crew, well, we'll just say they represent all those non-monetized clicks that sort of evaporated. So they had the same costume, they kind of behaved outwardly like a superhero, but when time came to step up, they really couldn't deliver true IT value management and IT delivery in terms of that value. So, our lesson was, or the lesson I took away from that was, how do you tell kind of the real from fake, the substance from foam? It's transparency. It's real models that allow you to very astutely connect value to business outcomes, to technology, to cost, to services cost, and so on. And so the ADAM framework and some of the key work the council has done to create standards and a model that allows people to compare things efficiently and effectively, I think is really key to effective TBM deployment. So you kind of can't do my argument TBM on your own. It does take the kind of Marvel superhero universe to pull this off, and that's largely what the council was trying to create at the outset, was the strength in lots of practitioners, kind of coming together to create value. So TBM as a platform, as a way of thinking and acting, was influenced by a lot of early work and a lot of different companies that came together to form the council. But the council is intended to really be to be able to bring those insights together and share those in ways that allow you to make sure you're generating value that's connected to and really ingrained in what your company is delivering. A big part of what's happening, or what happened in the last decade, is a shift from project to service, and then from service to product, and what that means, right? So a product-oriented or user-centric oriented IT function, what lots of people like to call digital transformation these days, is really about shifting to a TBM or value-based or business-based model and away from this sort of historic model of cost and tech stack. So the shift from cost to profit and then kind of back again, and from back to front, So instead of being focused on the data center, it's focused on the end user experience, the consumer, the customer, the market you're in, and then bringing that back to form the basis of value creation. And the model is really a lot of what TBM's about. And ultimately, it's the shift from integrator of technology stack to product manager, and from cost to profit center. It's occurring in so many businesses these days. In fact, I think what we're bringing to IT to some degrees is this sort of Kickstarter mindset where you create a product, that product has to resonate with people, you have to get people to fund that product through whatever means you use internally to do that annual operating plan and alignment. And increasingly, that's not a CFO, CEO committee of choice. It's a vibrant marketplace of ideas and value that's being driven across companies to make those choices in the context of which choices produce the greatest likelihood of value for the company. So that's kind of my, a fun way, I guess, to narrate my TBM story and TBM journey. And Tim, I'll hand it back to Q&A and any kind of conversations you guys want to have about, and I'm sure both Todd or I happy to field any more questions.
Absolutely. We have tons of questions for both of you. Specific for you, Ralph, we'll go with a couple here.
Okay. What are some CIO challenges you are faced with today that TBM can help address?
So there's two or three that come to mind as the sort of probably most common topics. So one, it's the typical, there's always the quote unquote backlog of IT projects. There's always more work to be done than there are people or time or budget to do them. And TBM can be a model, but one, by taking a very complex set of sort of costs and services and really being able to express those in terms of true cost and true value. So as an example, I had at Clorox, we were retiring a legacy mainframe environment that was costing me on the books $2 million a year to support and maintain. And when we retired it, what I found was I only achieved $1 million in savings. And so, of course, I go back and say, well, what happened? Where's the rest of my savings? We retired this environment. And then what you find is, oh, well, the $2 million included, part of that was a building that the mainframe data center was in. That building still has 2 or 3 other things in it. So that cost just got reallocated to another service that IT hasn't exited, and so on. So the ability to have a true services-based construct where I understand the second and third order consequence of actions, to be able to look at that holistically and make choices that allow me to capture full cost capture, cost exit, and so on is one way that it helps, I think, in the IT discussion. And the other is to sit down and have a meaningful conversation about a trade-off. So I've had here at Lumentum, we apply the TBM concepts and TBI model in some of our business unit conversations around what we call allocation. So we allocate costs to business unit based on their needs and their consumption of IT services. And one of our BUs was growing IT costs really, really dramatically. We were able to sit down and have the conversation about user behavior, business choices, et cetera, that connect to cost factors and value, and we're able to meaningfully reduce the operational costs of supporting the environment while dramatically improving the value generated just by bringing the right business owners to the table to talk about the right factors that really change the narrative away from kind of IT as a tax to IT as an enabler.
Great. What is the biggest barrier to TBM adoption?
So it's interesting. What you'll often find inside organizations is a resistance to change because people are in a place of people with a lot of knowledge have invested a lot of time and energy in that environment. So example, in a different case, I once rolled out a cloud-based content management platform at Clorox. All the users loved it. The teams using it that were doing team-based content collaboration loved the new UI and the new interface. But we had a really powerful set of users that were very resistant. And it turns out we were moving away from SharePoint toward this cloud-based content platform. And who were resistant were the 15 people who were certified SharePoint administrators in the company, but essentially gone to training and built their career and kind of felt threatened by the fact that, well, wait a minute, if this becomes easy, they won't need me anymore. And so some of the challenges with TBM is, hey, you'll have an IT finance person who's really good, who's got the, the spreadsheet with the 28 tabs and pivot tables and really keeps track of the IT spend in a really great way. They need to partner with TBM for it to be successful. But then they start to think, well, wait a minute, if I put this all in a tool in the cloud and I build the model, I'm no longer important. I'm no longer the answer person. So you've got to work through change like that, where people understand that their knowledge, their experience still can create and drive value, but just in a different way.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, if you don't mind, I'll add to that. One of the challenges I see a lot with, basically TBM programs that don't flourish are those where they haven't operationalized around the information that they get from TBM. So it's great to create, this transparency, do the costing, et cetera. But if you don't have a regular cadence about how you use the information, then you lack not only the outcomes that you need to be driving, but similarly, you don't have any hydraulic pressure back on TBM. And so TBM fails to evolve. It fails to address the data quality problems that everybody struggles with. There's just a lot of things missing when those regular reviews of the information aren't being done. So, for me, it's always job number one is how are you going to use this? How are you going to make that, formalized where people are using it as part of their job and know those outcomes going in?
Well, and I'll jump in as well. One of the business is TBM's middle name. And one of the best ways you can tank or really screw up a TBM implementation is by trying to do it in IT. At TBM, business is the core of TBM, and this has to be business-led, business-driven. It can't be an IT leader advocating for TBM without a business person who gets it, who's willing to be a sponsor, a partner, who wants to help change the way they interact with IT. As I said back in the 90s, it started that way at Cisco, and I think that remains true.
Yep.
Great.
Okay, I've got a question from West Eugene. With the evolving role of CIOs, the entrance of CDOs, and the development of CIO plus roles, should TBM continue to be driven by the CIO, CTO, CDO, CFO, COO, or CIO, or plus in the future?
I'll let Todd talk about what he's seen in other companies, but I'll give you my perspective. So quick lexicon thing just to get grounded. CIO generally, and still in most companies today, means you're focused on delivering technology to support the internal processes and functions of the company. CTO tends to mean you deliver technology and product that the customers of the companies consume. CDO typically means the CIO isn't progressive enough, and so they felt like they had to hire somebody different, but they didn't know what to call them. If you look at that taxonomy, it doesn't matter which of the three you report to, but I do believe understanding the way IT services are delivered or technology services and products are delivered, it's a different, just like running a manufacturing organization is different than running a sales organization. Running a technology delivery organization is different than most other functions in the company, and the T in TBM does matter. And so I continue to be a strong advocate and believe that TBM resources should report into and be heavily connected and supported by the technology leader. But as I mentioned earlier, it has to be done in partnership, a strong partnership with the business leaders, and not just the CFO, but with true business owners that own P&L and that want to engage and invest in IT differently.
Yeah, Ralph, I couldn't agree more. I think that some of it depends on the kind of use case, like where it starts. If you've got a CIO who, like you said, is focused on delivering that enterprise technology for internal processes, if the use case is that, and maybe it's delivered as a shared service, and there's a need for creating that accountability over consumption and so forth, then it's led by the CIO. But in other organizations where you have a situation where it's more of a product orientation and it's a CTO, et cetera, then the use case is different. But in all of those, the common thread is exactly what you said, Ralph. It's that collaboration, the conversations that you're having with the business partners, line of business leaders, et cetera, who ultimately are paying for everything.
Okay, here's a good question from Amy Blalick. Ralph, from your experience, what is your recommendation of where a TBM organization falls in a company? For example, within finance, or within IT, within transformation?
Yeah, I mean, we just talked a little bit about that. So I think it's fair to go in sort of IT or transformation. I've seen a dual relationship where it kind of dotted lines into both IT and finance. That's a great model. But I think it's got to be very connected to and really on or either directly on or very close to the senior staff of the IT or technology function.
Great, thank you. Here's another question from Victor. How do you explain rates of services that are based on spread, even allocations? On top of that, do you use the unit cost in the IT towers to build those rates?
Yeah, so there will be different allocation methods based on the kind of cost and the culture of the company. So I've seen cultures where, so for instance, we're a manufacturing culture, so I have some direct labor and some indirect labor costs in my manufacturing model. I've got, of course, knowledge workers across the globe. And so I wouldn't attribute the cost of my productivity suite, the Office 365 licenses, equally to headcount in every org, because some of those headcount are, factory line workers and aren't using the services and benefiting from them the same. So I might have a staggered model or a proportionate model based on how I allocate that cost. Yet, something else, another cost of conferencing services, I may be able to attribute based on usage, who's using Zoom or RingCentral more than others, and so on. So it's going to vary based on the service, the corporate culture. I know a lot of companies have a model that essentially says, keep it simple, unless I have a direct impact on behavior in order to change that use. I really don't want to spend a lot of time and energy getting wrapped up in it, and yet others worry a lot about how you burden the different BU with costs in order to make sure that BU maintains, attractive profitability and overhead costs in its go-to-market. So it's going to be somewhat culturally aligned and based on the kind of services you allocate.
Thank you. Last question. At Clorox, how long did it take you to get value from leveraging TBM?
So we started the journey kind of at the end of year one that I was there. The second year, so it was about a 6-month process to really build cost transparency around infrastructure, and so, which is where a lot of folks start, get infrastructure built and data loaded and so on. So we began getting very early value, and within the first year, the effort essentially justified itself because we went through a service provider transition where we transitioned from one outsourced provider to a model where we had 2 different outsourced providers through a new contract relationship. And TBM, the foundation of that TBM framework, allowed us to have really clarity on costs, particularly on infrastructure services, that allowed us to make both better choices in the RFP and the grant of that business, and I think really excellent choices in how we then transitioned. From there, the company continued we invested in creating, moving up the stack, if you will, up the model into the towers. We did a lot of work on forecasting and some other efforts. So we continued to both invest in enhancing TBM maturity and capabilities. And I think in each case, Clorox is a fairly conservative company. In each case, we were convinced that we would get ROI for that effort within a calendar year.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Any closing thoughts, views, Ralph or Todd, before we end this forum?
I was hoping you'd go first, Ralph. No, I'll just say this. The community that we have is here for you guys. And so if there is anything that you're struggling with, reach out to Tim, reach out to me, reach out to Ralph. Our board members are very passionate about this, and they all have, tons of experience, in implementing TBM in a, very complex situations and all of that. So leverage this community.
Well, the comment I'll make is like most things we look back on in the last 20 or 30 years, in hindsight, some of these things look simple and obvious. The smartphone revolution, mobile, user enablement, and so on, seem like obvious evolutionary choices. Of course, we would all want a beautiful smartphone to carry around with us that does all these things. It wasn't obvious when it came out, a decade ago. TBM, looking back, seems obvious and somewhat simple. Hey, it's about services-based costing, and it's about transparency, and it's about having conversations with the business. If that were true, if it were that obvious, it should have happened a long time ago. And so, while it is obvious, it does take work, it does take effort, and the biggest thing is getting out of your office, spending time with other people who have done it, learning from their experiences, and really engaging a dialogue with your business partners. And what I love about TBM is you can go to your business partner not with this idea and a spreadsheet and a thought about maybe trying to kind of do something different, but you can go with a book. You can go with a set of practitioners that are well into the thousands. You can go with half of the Fortune 500 have already embraced this model as a better way to discuss and invest in technology to deliver value within a company. So you've got the weight of the community to validate your knocking on the door of your business partner who doesn't, in some cases, view the IT leader as a true MBA style, business leader. And this can help change that for you. It gives you credibility. It gives you gravitas to the conversation in a way that really a lot of IT functions struggle with.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd, Ralph. Thank you so much. This has been awesome, outstanding. Feel free, everyone that's on the call, feel free to go to our LinkedIn, be part of the practice, and hopefully we will see everybody in 2 months in Las Vegas. With that said, have a great day, and thanks again for attending. Take care.